You'd think that a sharper mind would just lead to an easier life, right? That being smart simply solves problems. But what psychology is actually showing us, well, it's something completely different. Turns out, high intelligence doesn't get rid of your struggles, it just changes what they look like.
So, have you ever felt that your mind is this incredible, powerful engine, but it's also this incredibly heavy weight you have to carry around? If that feeling hits home, then this is for you. We're going to really unpack the psychology behind why that happens.
Because from the outside, you probably look like you've got it all together. Capable, calm, independent. But inside, it can be a totally different story. A nonstop churning dialogue of overthinking, of questioning, of deep self-doubt. And here's the most important part. This contrast, this gap between how you appear and how you feel, it's not some personal failing. It's actually a predictable pattern.
So let's just reframe this right now. We are not talking about flaws that you need to fix. We're talking about the built-in, standard-issue features of a very specific mental blueprint. And once you understand that blueprint, the whole experience starts to make a lot more sense.
Okay, let's start with the engine room of this whole thing, the high processing mind. We're talking about a brain that is essentially wired for continuous, non-stop analysis. So what does that actually feel like in practice? Well, it's that mind that just refuses to switch off, replaying conversations from days ago while you're trying to sleep. And it creates this strange paradox you might recognize, where you might seem lazy to other people, but internally you're incredibly ambitious. And that's because so much of your energy is being burned up just planning and analyzing before you even take a single action.
And that feeling of boredom, it's not a character flaw, it's a biological response. See, when your mind processes information too easily, it literally stops getting its chemical reward, the dopamine that keeps it engaged. Your brain is craving complexity and novelty. Without it, you just feel restless and, well, disengaged.
A key mechanism at play here is something psychologists call cognitive inhibition. The easiest way to think about it is like a mental pause button. Most people, they feel an impulse and they react. But this skill creates this tiny, critical gap between the feeling and the action. And in that gap, the analytical brain can step in. This single skill is an absolute game changer. It's the foundation for deliberate, thoughtful behavior instead of just pure reaction.
Now, this internal wiring, this combination of high processing and that cognitive pause button, it doesn't just stay in your head. Oh no. It directly shapes how you operate out in the world. And that often leads to a profound sense of independence.
And you can almost see how it builds, like a chain reaction. It starts with relying on internal validation. Your own standards matter more than public opinion. That forces you to think independently, to always ask, okay, but does this actually make logical sense? Which, in turn, leads you to question rules and authority, not out of rebellion, but from a real need to understand the why. And the natural outcome of all that, you just feel less social pressure to follow trends.
And this blueprint, it isn't always genetic. It's often hardwired by our earliest experiences. For a child who was emotionally overlooked or who had to take on adult responsibilities way too early, the brain adapts. It learns that support probably isn't on the way, so it just stops expecting it. You learn to rely on yourself first, simply because experience taught you that you had to.
But, and this is a really big but, there's an emotional consequence to all of this. This heightened awareness, this ability to process so much information, it inevitably comes at a cost.
Your mind is constantly connecting dots. You're seeing the long-term outcomes, the potential risks, the subtle patterns in other people's behavior that they themselves completely miss.
But when you process reality this deeply, you're not just anticipating simple problems. You end up grappling with the really big ones. Questions about meaning, purpose, and responsibility. And carrying that heavy awareness all the time, that's what can make you more vulnerable to chronic stress and what psychologists call existential anxiety. It's the inherent stress of confronting the fundamental questions of life.
And this leads to a really specific set of emotional consequences. You might feel out of sync with other people all the time because your mind is working several steps ahead of the conversation. You also tend to analyze your emotions rather than just feeling them. It's a defense mechanism. And maybe most powerfully, you develop this silent high emotional endurance. You learn to survive disappointment, in part because your analytical mind has already played out that exact possibility 100 times.
This chart illustrates that core internal conflict perfectly. You've got this massive, rich world of internal analysis, feeling, and processing going on inside. But what actually gets communicated to the outside world is often just a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And it isn't because you lack confidence. It's because the sheer effort of trying to translate that complex inner world, it feels draining and, a lot of the time, just futile.
So how do we put all of this together? Well, the key is a fundamental shift in perspective, moving from seeing these traits as flaws to really understanding them as features.
Psychology doesn't look at this mental blueprint and see something that's broken. It just sees a pattern. These struggles are not signs that something is wrong with you. They're the predictable, logical consequence of having a mind that processes the world with such unusual depth.
As our source material puts it so perfectly, intelligence doesn't just sharpen the mind, it intensifies awareness, emotion, and responsibility. It doesn't make life easier, it just makes it more intense. The weight you feel is simply the cost of that depth.
So the final question to leave you with is this. If you stop labeling these experiences as flaws and instead see them as the operational signature of your mind, how does that change the relationship you have with yourself?